They told him that the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. But Robert F. Williams looked around his hometown and saw it bending toward a noose. They told him that if he wanted freedom, he had to ask for it politely, with a suit on his back and a prayer on his lips. They told him that violence was the tool of the oppressor, and that the oppressed must be better, purer, softer. But Robert Williams was a United States Marine. He knew that in the real world, the only thing that stops a bad man with a gun is a good man who shoots back. So when the Ku Klux Klan decided to ride into his neighborhood to burn and kill, they didn't find a congregation of weeping victims. They found a fortress. They found sandbags on the porches, trenches in the yards, and a line of black men with steel in their hands and ice in their veins. This is the story of the man who taught the civil rights movement that the Second Amendment didn't just apply to white people. To understand why a civil rights leader would turn his home into a military bunker, you have to understand the raw, unvarnished reality of the American South in the 1950s. But before we descend into this war zone, I want to know where my battalion is watching from. Stop what you are doing right now, scroll down to the comments, and write your city or country. Let's see how far this signal reaches. Because the story I am about to tell you is not just American history. It is a universal lesson in survival that applies to anyone, anywhere, who has ever been told to kneel. Robert Franklin Williams was born in 1925 in Monroe, North Carolina, a town that appeared sleepy and charming on postcards, but functioned as a concentration camp without fences for its black residents. Monroe was the capital of the Ku Klux Klan in the region, a place where the invisible empire wasn't invisible at all. The Klan didn't just burn crosses in empty fields. They held massive public rallies that drew thousands. They operated with the full blessing and often the direct participation of the local police force and the city government. The sheriff, the mayor, the judge, in the eyes of the black community, they were all just Klansmen who took off their hoods during the day to put on ties. The atmosphere was one of suffocating, constant terror. A black man could be beaten on the street for looking a white woman in the eye. A black woman could be sexually assaulted by a white man, and the police would laugh if she tried to report it. The law was not a shield. It was a weapon used to enforce a rigid, brutal hierarchy. The message sent to the black community was clear. You have no rights that a white man is bound to respect. You are property. You are prey. And if you try to fight back, the full weight of the state will crush you. Most people kept their heads down. They survived by making themselves small, by teaching their children to be invisible. It was a survival strategy born of necessity and fear. But Robert Williams was not good at being invisible. He grew up hearing the stories of his grandmother, a former slave who lived to be 104. She didn't tell him stories about the benevolent master. She handed him the rifle that his grandfather had used to defend their family during the chaotic days after the Civil War. She taught him that freedom wasn't a gift. It was something you held onto with a tight grip. She showed him the weapon as a tool of survival, stripping away the fear of it. From a young age, Williams understood that the ability to inflict violence was the only thing that commanded respect in a violent world. As a young man, Williams joined the Great Migration, heading north to Detroit to find work in the auto factories. But he didn't find a promised land. In 1943, he witnessed the Detroit race riots, seeing firsthand that the North had its own brand of savage racism. He saw white mobs pulling black workers off streetcars and beating them. He saw that the hatred wasn't regional, it was national. But it was his time in the United States Marine Corps that truly forged him. He served for 18 months, and the Corps taught him things that a black man in the South wasn't supposed to know. It taught him discipline. It taught him strategy. It taught him how to strip and clean a rifle in the dark, how to set up a defensive perimeter, and how to squeeze a trigger without hesitation. He returned to Monroe in 1955, a veteran who had been willing to die for his country, only to find that his country was still willing to kill him. He stepped off the bus into a town that was more segregated and more violent than when he had left. The disparity was galling. He had worn the uniform of a superpower, but he couldn't buy a sandwich at the drugstore counter. He had been trained to fight tyranny abroad, but he was expected to submit to tyranny at home. The cognitive dissonance was enough to break a man or to radicalize him. Williams chose the latter. He looked at the local chapter of the NCLACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. At the time, the NCLACP was the premier civil rights organization in the country, known for its legal battles and its middle-class respectability. But in Monroe, the chapter was dying. The KKK had terrorized its members. The local leadership, mostly comprised of doctors, teachers, and ministers, people with something to lose, had been cowed into silence. Membership had dwindled to 6 people. The Klan had effectively won. They had frightened the respectable black folks into submission. Robert Williams decided to take over. He became the president of the Monroe chapter, but he didn't try to recruit the doctors and the preachers. He knew they were too afraid, too invested in the status quo to risk their livelihoods and their lives. Instead, Williams went to the pool halls. He went to the street corners. He went to the bars and the beauty parlors. He recruited the people who had nothing to lose but their chains. He recruited the janitors, the sharecroppers, the laborers, and most importantly, the fellow veterans. He found men who had served in World War II and Korea, men who knew how to handle a weapon. He transformed the Monroe NAACP from a debating society into a working-class organization with a spine of steel. This was a seismic shift. The civil rights movement is often portrayed as a movement of the church and the courtroom. Robert Williams was building a movement of the trench and the barricade. Under his leadership, the chapter exploded. They began to file petitions to integrate the public swimming pools, which were funded by tax dollars but forbidden to black children. In the sweltering heat of the North Carolina summer, black children watched white children swim while they were told to play in the dirt. The swimming pool was a powerful symbol. It wasn't just about water. It was about the purity of the white body and the supposed contamination of the black body. By demanding access, Williams was striking at the deepest psychosexual fears of the white South. The white establishment of Monroe was stunned. They were used to good Negroes who knew their place. They didn't know how to handle this articulate, fearless Marine who quoted the Constitution and refused to back down. The reaction was predictable: violence. The Klan began a campaign of terror against Williams and his new recruits. They started with the phone calls, heavy breathing, racial slurs, threats to kill his wife and children. Then came the drive-bys. Cars full of white men would cruise past his house at night, shouting threats, firing shots into the air. They burned crosses on the lawns of NAACP members. The police, led by Chief Monty, did absolutely nothing. In fact, the police cars often escorted the Klan motorcades, their lights flashing to clear the way for the terrorists. Williams realized quickly that the law was not coming to save him. He looked at his wife, Mabel, and his 2 young sons. He looked at the people he had convinced to join the movement. He realized that he was responsible for their lives, and he made a decision that would alienate him from the mainstream civil rights leadership, but would make him a hero to the people of Monroe. He went to the National Rifle Association. In one of the great ironies of history, Robert Williams, a black radical, chartered a local NRA gun club. He called it the Black Armed Guard. He used the charter to legally buy rifles and ammunition. He began to train his members, men and women, in marksmanship and firearm safety. He wasn't building a gang. He was building a militia. He drilled them on how to defend a house. He taught them fire discipline. Never shoot unless you have a target. Never shoot unless you are shot at. We are not aggressors, he told them. We will never fire the first shot. But if they bring violence to us, we will meet them with violence. We will protect our women and children. We will protect our homes. The atmosphere in Monroe shifted. The air grew heavy with the static electricity of impending war. The Klan, used to victims who ran away or prayed for mercy, sensed a change. They saw the black folks standing a little straighter. They saw the grim determination in their eyes. They didn't know about the rifles stacked behind the doors. They didn't know about the sandbags lining the porches. They thought they were still the predators. They were about to find out that the prey had grown teeth. But before the shooting started, an event occurred in 1958 that would strip away any remaining illusion that the system could be reformed peacefully. It was a case involving two little boys, a game, and a kiss. It was called the kissing case, and it would show Robert Williams and the world just how sick the soul of the South really was. It began simply enough. Two young black boys, David Simpson, aged 7, and Hanover Thompson, aged 9, were playing a game with neighborhood children. In the course of the game, a fleeting, innocent moment occurred between Hanover and a young white girl. It was the kind of trivial interaction that, in any sane society, would have been forgotten by dinner time. But Monroe, North Carolina, was not a sane society. When word of the game reached the girl's parents, the reaction was disproportionate and swift. Police cruisers descended on the black neighborhood. The two boys were taken into custody. They were not taken to their parents. They were taken directly to the county jail. For 6 days, these two elementary school students were held in detention, isolated from their families, denied legal counsel, and subjected to intense interrogation. The authorities refused to let the parents see their sons. The psychological pressure placed on the families was immense. The local community was paralyzed by fear. Rumors swirled that the boys might never be released, or worse. The local Ku Klux Klan made its presence known, holding rallies and burning crosses, creating an atmosphere of impending doom. When the case finally came before a judge, the proceedings were a mockery of justice. The boys appeared in court without an attorney. In a ruling that shocked even those accustomed to the harshness of Jim Crow justice, the judge declared the boys to be a danger to the community. He sentenced them to an indeterminate term in a reformatory. They were to be locked away until they turned 21. For a childhood game, two boys were effectively given a 14-year prison term. This was the moment Robert F. Williams stepped into the breach. He looked at the terrified parents. He looked at the smug satisfaction of the town officials, and he realized that fighting this in the local courts was a waste of time. The judge, the police, the jury, they were all part of the same club. You couldn't ask the fox to give a fair trial to the chickens. Williams knew he had to change the battlefield. If he couldn't get justice in Monroe, he would bring the judgment of the world down upon Monroe. Williams was a brilliant strategist. He understood the geopolitical climate of 1958 perfectly. The United States was locked in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, trying to win the hearts and minds of developing nations in Africa and Asia. The US government was desperate to portray itself as the beacon of freedom and democracy. Williams saw the hypocrisy, and he decided to weaponize it. He realized that the one thing the white establishment feared more than black rebellion was international embarrassment. He went to work. He fired off telegrams to the national media. He contacted the major civil rights organizations in New York. He reached out to the socialist press, knowing they would amplify the story globally. He framed the narrative brilliantly. Is this the American justice you preach to the world? A land where 7-year-olds are sentenced to prison for playing a game? The story exploded. It didn't just make the local papers. It went viral before the internet existed. Headlines appeared in London, Paris, Rome, and, most damagingly for the US State Department, in Moscow and Beijing. The kissing case became a cause célèbre. In Europe, committees were formed to demand the boys' release. Protests were held outside American embassies. The pressure on the governor of North Carolina, Luther Hodges, became unbearable. Thousands of letters poured into his office from all over the globe. The White House, embarrassed and furious at the bad publicity, began to lean on the state officials. The local judge and the town of Monroe, who had thought they were simply teaching a lesson to the locals, suddenly found themselves the villains of a global drama. After 3 months of intense international pressure, the state of North Carolina blinked. Governor Hodges, claiming he was acting out of benevolence rather than political necessity, ordered the immediate release of David Simpson and Hanover Thompson. The boys were returned to their mothers. It was a total, humiliating defeat for the segregationist establishment of Monroe. They had tried to crush 2 families, and instead, they had been forced to back down by a black man who knew how to fight. But the victory came at a steep price. The kissing case made Robert Williams the most hated man in North Carolina. To the Klan and the white supremacists, he was no longer just an annoyance. He was an existential threat. He had humiliated them on the world stage. He had proven that their power was not absolute. And for that, they decided he had to die. The threats against Williams escalated from phone calls to direct action. The Klan began to openly discuss his assassination. The local police made it clear that if something happened to him, they would look the other way. Williams looked at the situation with the cold, tactical eye of a Marine. He had won the media war, but words wouldn't stop a bullet. The international press had gone home. The cameras were gone, but the Klan was still there, and they were angry. Williams gathered the men of the local AACP chapter. These weren't the lawyers and doctors who ran the national organization in New York. These were the men from the pool halls, the construction sites, the veterans of Korea and World War II who had seen the world and knew how it worked. He laid it out for them plainly. The law had failed. The government was indifferent. The enemy was at the gates, and they were armed. The victory in the kissing case had humiliated the white establishment, and now they wanted blood. "We cannot rely on the law to protect us," Williams told them, his voice steady and cold. "The law is the one attacking us. We have a constitutional right to life, and we have a constitutional right to defend that life. If they bring violence to us, we will meet them with violence." He didn't call for a riot. He didn't call for aggression. He called for discipline. He turned his chapter into a defensive unit. They bought rifles. They built sandbag fortifications on their porches. They set up a system of telephone trees to alert the community of Klan raids. They established patrols. This was the birth of the Black Armed Guard. Williams was changing the rules of the civil rights movement. While Dr. King was preaching nonviolence in Montgomery, arguing that unearned suffering was redemptive, Robert Williams was in Monroe, oiling his rifle and teaching his neighbors how to create a crossfire. He argued that nonviolence was a noble tactic against a civilized opponent, but against the Klan, it was suicide. "I am not a pacifist," he famously declared. "I am a survivalist." By the summer of 1957, the Cold War in Monroe turned hot. The Klan had decided to strike at the head of the snake, but they knew Williams was too well guarded, so they targeted Dr. Albert Perry, the vice president of the Monroe NAACP. Perry was a successful physician, a Catholic, and a man who had committed the unforgivable sin of building a modern house with a swimming pool in a town where black people were supposed to be poor. Rumors circulated that the Klan was going to burn Perry out and kill him on a specific night. But Robert Williams had mobilized the guard. He treated Perry's home not as a house, but as a forward operating base. They reinforced the walls with sandbags. They dug foxholes in the backyard. They positioned men with rifles at strategic points around the property, creating overlapping fields of fire. Inside the house, the women and children were moved to the safest rooms, protected by mattresses and furniture. It was a scene reminiscent of a besieged outpost in Korea, transplanted to a suburban lawn in North Carolina. As darkness fell, the silence was absolute. The men in the trenches checked their weapons. They were farmers, mechanics, and veterans, holding hunting rifles, shotguns, and surplus military carbines. They were terrified. Any sane man would be, but their fear was eclipsed by a grim, icy resolve. They had drawn a line in the dirt. They would not retreat 1 inch further. Then, the headlights appeared. It started as a low rumble, then grew into a roar. A motorcade of cars, filled with Klansmen, turned onto the street. The lead car slowed as it approached Dr. Perry's driveway. The Klan was used to the psychology of terror. They expected the lights and the noise to send the inhabitants fleeing out the back door. They expected to fire a few shots into the windows, throw some torches, and watch the house burn while laughing. They were bullies who had never been punched back. The lead car stopped. A Klansman leaned out the window, shouting a racial slur, and fired a pistol into the air. The response was instantaneous and overwhelming. From the shadows of the porch, from the bushes, from the sandbagged windows, the black armed guard opened fire. It was not the panicked, sporadic firing of frightened men. It was a disciplined, withering volley. Bullets tore into the Klan's cars, shattering windshields, punching through doors, flattening tires. The air filled with the smell of cordite and the screams of men who had suddenly realized they were not the hunters, but the prey. The Klansmen panicked. This was not in the script. Black people were not supposed to shoot back. The driver of the lead car slammed on the gas, trying to escape, but his tires were shredded. He spun out into a ditch. Other cars crashed into each other in a desperate attempt to turn around. Men scrambled out of their vehicles, crawling through the mud on their bellies, terrified, shouting for mercy. The invincible knights of the Ku Klux Klan were reduced to whimpering figures in the dirt, pinned down by the steady, accurate fire of the men they despised. The shootout lasted only a few minutes, but it changed everything. The Klan retreated in disgrace, dragging their damaged cars and their shattered egos back to the white side of town. Remarkably, no one was killed, though several Klansmen were reportedly wounded. But the psychological casualty count was total. The myth of white invincibility had been punctured by a .30 caliber bullet. When the police finally arrived, late as always, they didn't arrest the Klansmen. They didn't investigate the attempted arson. They drove straight to Dr. Perry's house, intending to disarm the black defenders. But when the chief of police stepped out of his car, he found himself looking down the barrel of Robert Williams's rifle. "We are protecting our homes," Williams told him, his voice calm and cold. "If you come in here to disarm us and leave us to the Klan, you will have to come through us, and we will die before we give up our guns." The chief looked at Williams. He looked at the grim faces of the men behind the sandbags. He saw veterans who knew how to kill, and he realized that if he tried to force the issue, it would be a bloodbath that he might not survive. The police got back in their cars and left. That night, Robert Williams proved a theory that would shake the foundations of the civil rights movement. Racism, for all its bluster, was cowardly. When confronted with lethal force, the terrorists backed down. The attacks on Dr. Perry's house stopped. The Klan raids in that neighborhood ceased. The rifle had achieved what the petition could not. It had bought peace. But while Williams had won the battle on the streets of Monroe, he was about to ignite a war within his own movement. The news of the shootout reached the national headquarters of the NAACP in New York, and the reaction was not celebration, it was horror. The mainstream civil rights leadership, led by men like Roy Wilkins and, philosophically, by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., was deeply committed to the strategy of nonviolent resistance. They believed that the moral high ground was their most powerful weapon. They needed to show the world that they were better than their oppressors, that they could meet violence with love and suffering. They feared that images of black men with guns would alienate white liberals, provoke a massive government crackdown, and lead to a race war that black Americans could not win. To them, Robert Williams was a dangerous liability. He was going off script. He was a loose cannon who threatened to blow up the delicate political coalitions they were building. The conflict came to a head in 1959, after a white jury in Monroe acquitted a white man who had brutally assaulted a black woman, despite overwhelming evidence. Williams stood on the courthouse steps, seething with anger. He spoke to a reporter, and his words were broadcast across the nation. "We must meet violence with violence. Since the federal government will not stop the Klan, we must stop the Klan." It was a soundbite heard around the world. The New York Times ran it on the front page. The NAACP leadership went apocalyptic. Roy Wilkins immediately suspended Williams from his position as president of the Monroe chapter. He called Williams a gangster, a thug who was dragging the movement into the gutter. Williams fought back. He wasn't a gangster, he was a survivor. He argued that there was a fundamental difference between aggressive violence and self-defense. "I am not advocating that we go out and attack white people," he explained. "I am advocating that we do not let them kill us." Gandhi was a great man, but Gandhi was dealing with the British, who had a conscience. We are dealing with the Klan. You cannot shame a man who has no shame. You cannot convert a man who wants you dead. You can only stop him. This was the great schism of the movement. On one side was the dream of nonviolence, the hope for a beloved community. On the other side was the reality of the rifle, the necessity of survival in a hostile land. Williams wrote his manifesto, Negroes with Guns, laying out his philosophy. It wasn't a rejection of civil rights. It was a demand for human rights, specifically the right to life. He traveled the country, debating the pacifists, arguing that nonviolence was a tactic, not a religion, and that it shouldn't be the only tool in the toolbox. He found a receptive audience among the younger generation of activists, the students, the radicals, the people who were tired of getting beaten and jailed without fighting back. He was planting the seeds for the Black Power movement that would explode a decade later. But in Monroe, the situation was deteriorating. The Klan, humiliated but not defeated, was regrouping. The police were looking for any excuse to crush Williams and his black armed guard. The national NAACP had cut off his funding and support. He was isolated, surrounded by enemies, with a price on his head and a target on his back. And he was about to walk into a trap that had been carefully laid to destroy him once and for all. The era of the shootout was over. The era of the manhunt was about to begin. By the summer of 1961, Monroe, North Carolina, was no longer just a town. It was a burning fuse attached to the powder keg of American race relations. The Freedom Riders, young idealists committed to nonviolence, decided to come to Monroe to prove that love could conquer the hate that Williams was fighting with rifles. They wanted to show that Martin Luther King's way could work even in the capital of the Klan. Williams welcomed them, but he warned them. He told them, "You can come here with your nonviolence, and I will honor it. But understand this, if they try to kill you, I will not let you die. My men will protect you, and we will not be using prayers to do it." It was an uneasy alliance. The pacifists marched in the town square, singing, "We shall overcome," while Williams's black-armed guard watched from the rooftops and the alleyways, their hands resting on the bolts of their rifles, scanning the crowd for the inevitable violence. It didn't take long. On Sunday, August 27th, 1961, the white mob descended. Thousands of angry white men, fueled by hate and encouraged by the police, attacked the Freedom Riders at the county courthouse. The pacifists were beaten with baseball bats, chains, and rocks. The police stood by and watched, smiling. The nonviolent strategy was failing in real time, drowning in blood. The battered protesters retreated to the black neighborhood, to the sanctuary of Robert Williams's home. It was in this chaotic, swirling atmosphere of near riot that the trap was sprung. A white couple, Bruce and Mabel Stiegel, drove their car into the black neighborhood. To this day, it is unclear whether they were lost, or if they were provocateurs sent to incite a reaction. But as they drove through the angry, terrified crowd of black residents who had just watched their friends being beaten at the courthouse, the car was surrounded. The people were furious. They started rocking the car, shouting. The situation was seconds away from turning into a lynching in reverse. Robert Williams saw the commotion from his porch. He didn't see enemies. He saw human beings in danger. He waded into the angry crowd, using his authority and his physical strength to push people back. He ordered the Stegels to get out of the car and brought them into his own home for their protection. He told them, "You are safe here until the crowd disperses." He saved their lives. But the authorities in Monroe didn't see a rescue. They saw an opportunity. Within minutes, the narrative was twisted. The police chief declared that Robert Williams, the dangerous radical, had kidnapped a white couple and was holding them hostage. It was a lie, but it was a lie that gave the state the excuse it had been waiting for. The reaction was overwhelming. The governor of North Carolina mobilized the National Guard. State troopers flooded the town. The FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover, who hated Williams with a personal passion, issued a warrant for his arrest on charges of kidnapping across state lines. Williams was officially declared armed and dangerous. A shoot-to-kill order was effectively in place. Williams looked out his window and saw the end coming. He saw the National Guard trucks, the machine guns mounted on jeeps, the helicopters circling overhead. He knew that if he stayed in that house, he would be dead before morning. He knew there would be no trial, only a massacre. He looked at his wife, Mabel, and his 2 young sons. He realized the only way to continue the fight was to survive. What followed was a desperate, high-speed escape that reads like a Hollywood spy thriller. Williams and his family slipped out the back of their house just as the police cordon was closing in. They were smuggled out of Monroe in a hearse, hidden under a tarp, a symbolic death and rebirth. They switched cars on back roads, moving through the night, hunted by every law enforcement agency in the country. The FBI launched one of the largest manhunts in its history. Wanted posters with Williams's face were plastered in every post office, from Florida to Maine. The radio broadcast his description every hour. But Williams had friends. He had built a network of supporters, not the mainstream liberals, but the radicals, the socialists, the people who knew how to move in the shadows. They passed him from safe house to safe house, moving him north, always one step ahead of the dragnet. He reached New York City, but he knew he wasn't safe there. The FBI was tearing the city apart looking for him. He had to leave the country. But where could a black radical go in 1961? Europe was an ally of the US. Africa was still largely under colonial rule. There was only one place in the Western Hemisphere that would welcome an enemy of the United States government with open arms: Canada. And from Canada, a flight to the Forbidden Island. Williams crossed the border into Canada, disguised, his nerves frayed to the breaking point. From there, he boarded a plane. When he landed, he wasn't in a free country, not in the American sense. He stepped onto the tarmac in Havana, Cuba. He was greeted not as a criminal, but as a hero. Fidel Castro, the bearded revolutionary who had just defied the American empire at the Bay of Pigs, embraced him. For the American government, this was a nightmare scenario. The most dangerous black man in America had just joined forces with the most dangerous communist in the hemisphere. Williams's exile had begun. But he was not going to go quietly into the night. He was not going to sit on a beach and drink rum. He asked Castro for a weapon. Castro offered him a gun. Williams shook his head. "I don't need a gun here," he said. "I need a microphone." He wanted to reach back across the water, past the Coast Guard cutters and the jamming signals, and speak directly to the black people of the South. He wanted to tell them the truth that the American media was hiding. He wanted to keep the fire burning. Castro gave him a 50,000-watt transmitter. In 1962, the airwaves of the American South began to crackle with a new sound. It wasn't the polite sermons of the civil rights leaders. It was the sound of the newest, hottest jazz and blues records, music that was hard to find on white radio stations. And in between the tracks of Charlie Parker and John Coltrane, a voice would cut in. A voice that was calm, deep, and dripping with revolutionary fire. "This is Radio Free Dixie," Robert Williams would say, his voice traveling over the Florida Straits, bouncing off the ionosphere, and landing in the transistor radios of sharecroppers in Mississippi and factory workers in Detroit. The music of the freedom struggle. He told them to arm themselves. He told them to stop begging and start demanding. He read news reports of American atrocities in Vietnam and connected them to the police brutality in Birmingham. He was the first man to globalize the black struggle in real time. He became a phantom voice, haunting the US government from 90 miles away. The CIA tried to jam the signal. The FBI harassed anyone who listened to it, but they couldn't stop it. For the young activists of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and the emerging leaders of the Black Power movement, Radio Free Dixie was electric. It was forbidden knowledge. Williams became a mythic figure, the Che Guevara of the civil rights movement. He was the man who had stood up, fought back, and gotten away. But exile is a gilded cage. As the years passed, the politics of the Cold War shifted. Castro needed to improve relations with the Soviet Union, and the Soviets were wary of Williams's radicalism. Williams, ever the independent thinker, began to chafe under the restrictions of Cuban life. He realized that he had traded one master for another. He wasn't a communist puppet. He was a black nationalist, and his loyalty was only to his people. He looked at the map. Again, if the US was his enemy and the Soviets were untrustworthy, where could he go? There was only one other player on the board big enough to defy them all. China. In 1966, Robert Williams packed his bags again. He took his family and flew to Beijing. He was welcomed by Mao Zedong himself. He became the only American civil rights leader to live inside the Cultural Revolution. From China, he continued to write, to broadcast, to agitate. He wrote The Crusader, a newsletter that taught urban guerrilla warfare tactics to the youth of America's ghettos. Back home, the seeds he had planted were exploding. The Watts riots, the rise of the Black Panther Party. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, the founders of the Panthers, read Negroes with Guns like a Bible. They didn't adopt King's philosophy. They adopted Williams' philosophy. When the Panthers marched into the California State House with shotguns, they were walking in the footsteps of Robert Williams. He was the godfather of Black Power, the architect of the militant turn. But the world had not forgotten Robert Williams, and surprisingly, the United States government found that it needed him. By 1969, the geopolitical landscape had shifted beneath the feet of the Cold Warriors. America was bleeding in Vietnam, cities were burning at home, and the Soviet Union remained a looming nuclear threat. In the White House, President Richard Nixon, a staunch anti-communist, was secretly plotting a diplomatic coup that would change the balance of power forever, the opening of relations with Communist China. But Nixon had a problem. He had no back channel. The diplomatic lines had been cut for decades. He had no one who could speak to Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. No one who had the trust of the Chinese leadership. No one, that is, except for a fugitive black revolutionary from Monroe, North Carolina, who was currently living in Beijing as an honored guest of the state. In a twist of irony that no fiction writer would dare invent, the United States government realized that Robert F. Williams, the man they had hunted as a terrorist, the man J. Edgar Hoover had obsessed over, was now a strategic asset. And Williams, watching the turmoil in his homeland from thousands of miles away, realized that his time in exile was done. He missed the red clay of the South. He missed his people. He wanted to return to the fight, not as a voice on the radio or a writer in a distant land, but as a man on the ground. A delicate, secret dance began between the revolutionary and the administration. The State Department signaled that if Williams returned, he would not be shot on sight. He would face the kidnapping charges in North Carolina, yes, but he would be allowed to fight them in court, and the federal pursuit would cool. Williams accepted the gamble. He knew the risks. He knew the Klan still had a long memory, but he also knew that the America of 1969 was not the America of 1961. The movement he had helped birth had grown up. It had grown teeth. In September 1969, Robert F. Williams boarded a flight in London, bound for Detroit. As the plane touched down on American soil, the FBI was waiting, but so were his supporters. He stepped off the plane, not in handcuffs, but with his fist raised, a symbol of unrepentant strength. He was arrested, of course, on the outstanding fugitive warrant from North Carolina. But the dynamic had shifted. He was no longer a lonely agitator in a small town. He was an international celebrity, a symbol of resistance who had the support of the Black Panther Party, the anti-war movement, and legal teams from across the country. He posted bail almost immediately. The America he returned to was a place transformed by the very ideas he had championed. He looked around and saw the Black Panthers running free breakfast programs and patrolling the streets with shotguns in Oakland. He saw college students demanding Black Studies programs. He saw a pride and a militancy that had been absent when he left. He realized that while he was gone, his manifesto, Negroes with Guns, had gone from a radical theory to a reality on the streets of Chicago, Detroit, and New York. He was the grandfather of this revolution, the man who had proved it was possible to stand up and survive. But the ghost of Monroe was still haunting him. The state of North Carolina was determined to put him in prison for the alleged kidnapping of the Stegall couple in 1961. They wanted to make an example of him. They wanted to prove that you couldn't defy the white power structure, flee the country, and then come back on your own terms. The legal battle that ensued would drag on for nearly 6 long years. It was a war of motions, appeals, and delays, fought not with bullets, but with legal briefs. Williams approached his defense with the same aggressive strategy he had used against the Klan. He didn't apologize. He put the state on trial. His lawyers argued that the charges were politically motivated, a fabrication designed to crush a civil rights leader. They pointed out the absurdity of the kidnapping, that Williams had actually saved the couple from a mob that would have likely killed them. As the case dragged on, the state's resolve began to crumble. The world had changed too much. The alleged victim, Mabel Stegall, eventually admitted in depositions that she hadn't really felt kidnapped in the traditional sense, but rather detained for her own safety. The racial climate in North Carolina was shifting. The old guard was dying out or losing power. Prosecuting a world-famous figure who had advised the president on China for a decade-old, trumped-up charge began to look less like justice and more like a vindictive embarrassment for the state. Finally, in 1975, the state of North Carolina quietly dropped all charges. There was no apology, no admission of guilt. They simply let it go. Robert F. Williams was a free man. He had beaten the Klan in the streets. He had beaten the FBI in the manhunt. And now he had beaten the court system. He had fought the law, and for once, the law didn't win. With his legal troubles finally behind him, Williams settled into a life that was surprisingly quiet, given the storm of his earlier years. He accepted a position as a researcher at the University of Michigan. He became an elder statesman, a mentor to younger activists. He didn't seek the spotlight. He watched as the civil rights movement fractured and evolved. He saw the excesses of the radical left, and he saw the retrenchment of the conservative right. He remained a sharp critic of American imperialism and racism, but he also warned against reckless violence. He knew the cost of war. He knew that a gun was a tool for survival, not a fetish for revolutionaries who didn't understand the consequences of pulling the trigger. He wrote, he lectured, and he lived. He watched his sons grow up in a country that was still flawed, still racist, but undeniably freer than the one he had been born into. He lived to see the integration of the schools in Monroe, the very thing he had fought for. He lived to see black mayors and black police chiefs. He knew that the work wasn't done, but he also knew that the heavy lifting he had done in the trenches of the 1950s had laid the foundation for it all. While Robert Williams lived a quiet life in Michigan in the 1970s and 80s, the seeds he had planted in the bloody soil of Monroe 2 decades earlier had grown into a forest that reshaped the American landscape. To truly understand his significance, we must look beyond his biography and into the intellectual revolution he engineered. He was not just a man with a gun, he was a philosopher of survival, and his greatest weapon was not the rifle, but the book he wrote in exile. When Negroes with Guns was published in 1962, it was treated as dangerous contraband. It was passed hand to hand in dorm rooms, pool halls, and prisons. For a generation of young black Americans who were watching their leaders get beaten and killed while singing hymns, Williams's words were electric. He didn't speak of suffering as a virtue. He spoke of dignity as a non-negotiable right. He argued that the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal protection, was meaningless without the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. The most famous disciples of Robert Williams were 2 young men in Oakland, California, Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. When they founded the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in 1966, they didn't pull their ideology out of thin air. They pulled it directly from the pages of Williams's life. The Panthers' signature tactic, patrolling the police, openly carrying shotguns, asserting their constitutional rights, was the Monroe model transplanted to the West Coast. Williams was the spiritual grandfather of the Black Power movement. Without his stand in North Carolina, there would likely have been no Black Panthers, no raised fists at the 1968 Olympics, no shift from asking for freedom to demanding power. But Williams's legacy is more complex than just guns. He forced the civil rights movement to evolve. There is a popular historical myth that presents Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Williams as mortal enemies, the saint versus the sinner. But the truth is far more nuanced. They were not opposites. They were 2 necessary hands of the same body. King provided the moral pressure. Williams provided the physical reality check. In the later years of the movement, even King began to recognize the validity of Williams's position. King eventually employed armed bodyguards to protect his family. He famously acknowledged that while he preached nonviolence as a public policy, he could not deny a man the right to protect his home. Williams had shifted the Overton window, the range of acceptable discourse. By staking out the radical position of armed defense, he made the moderate demands of King seem more reasonable to the white establishment. The government dealt with King partly because they were terrified of the alternative, Robert Williams. Williams also pioneered the concept of black internationalism. Before him, the civil rights struggle was seen as a domestic American dispute. Williams blew the walls off. By going to Cuba, by going to China, by speaking on Radio Hanoi, He reframed the plight of Black Americans as part of a global struggle against colonialism. He told the world, "We are not just a minority in America. We are part of the global majority of colored peoples." This terrified the U.S. State Department and forced them to accelerate reforms at home to save face abroad. He proved that international embarrassment was a potent political tool. Furthermore, his life offers a profound lesson on the Second Amendment that is often ignored by modern gun rights activists. For Robert Williams, the gun was not a fetish or a symbol of rugged individualism. It was a tool of collective survival for a marginalized community. He demonstrated that gun control laws in the South were historically designed to disarm Black people, to leave them vulnerable to the Klan. His fight for the right to bear arms was, at its core, a fight against systemic racism. He reclaimed the gun from the hands of the oppressor and placed it in the hands of the oppressed, transforming it from a symbol of terror into a symbol of liberation. As he aged, Williams watched the struggles of the 1980s and 90s, the Rodney King beating, the crack epidemic, the rise of mass incarceration. He saw that the uniforms of the oppressors had changed, from white robes to blue uniforms or gray suits, but the dynamic of power remained the same. He warned that the fight was not over. He told the younger generation that integration had brought them into the same buildings as white people, but it hadn't necessarily guaranteed them the same safety. In his final years, he became a symbol of uncompromising integrity. He had never sold out. He had never apologized. He had never knelt. In a movement filled with martyrs who died young, Williams committed the ultimate act of defiance. He survived. He lived to see his enemies buried. He lived to see the history books rewritten to include him. Robert F. Williams died in 1996 at the age of 71. He died in his bed, surrounded by family, a peaceful end for a warrior who had spent his life in the trenches. His funeral in Monroe was a moment of profound reconciliation. The town that had once hunted him now welcomed him home as a hero. Rosa Parks attended his funeral. She sat in the pews and honored the man who had taken a different path than her, but a path that led to the same destination. It was a final vindication. The gangster, the thug, the terrorist was laid to rest as a patriot. His influence is arguably stronger today than it was when he was alive. In an era where police brutality is captured on smartphones and the question of how do we protect our bodies is once again central to the national conversation, Robert Williams speaks from the grave. He reminds us that the state does not always have a monopoly on legitimate force. He reminds us that when the social contract is broken by those in power, the people have a right to forge a new one in the fire of resistance. He forced America to look in the mirror. He exposed the hypocrisy of a nation that glorified the violence of the Minutemen in 1776, but condemned the violence of Black men in 1957. He demanded that the Second Amendment apply to everyone, not just the privileged. He argued that self-defense is not violence. It is intelligence. It is the assertion of one's own worth. Today, as we debate justice, protest, and the right to bear arms, Robert Williams stands as a giant in the shadows. He is the patron saint of those who refuse to be victims. He is the reminder that the hand that holds the olive branch must sometimes be backed up by the hand that holds the shield. He was told he was a monster. He proved he was a man. He was told to run. He stood his ground. He was told to die. He lived. And in the end, that was his greatest victory. He survived to tell his story. And in doing so, he gave us a blueprint for courage that is as relevant today as it was the night he picked up a rifle and defended his home in Monroe. The war for dignity is never over, but thanks to Robert Williams, we know how to fight it. We fight it on our feet, not on our knees.